You are listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. And coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug, and today my very special guest. And I've got to tell you right at the beginning of today's show that the opinions expressed here are solely those of myself and my guest and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. And I said I had a very special guest today. I have Dr. Jessica Willis from Women and Gender Studies at Eastern Washington University. Hi, Jessica.
Hi there, Gary. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to the show. I also wanted to let everyone know that while I am the faculty member at Women's and Gender Studies at Eastern Washington University, I'm not representing their beliefs or positions either. I'm solely here as an individual and an intellectual, and just thrilled to join you today.
Well, thank you, and it's lovely to have you on the show. And I'm so pleased to get you because there have been a couple of episodes in the culture sphere lately around issues of identity.
Yes.
There was Emma Sulkovitz, who I talked about in a previous show, and her identity as a rape victim. And lately, of course, we've had Ms. Dolezal. And I'm not going to talk about her because I don't want to get into the feeding frenzy, but I do want to get into these very interesting questions with you about identity. So, it occurs to me that if you lived in isolation on a desert island, you would have no identity because you need others to have an identity with. It's not something we're born with. It's not something that falls from the heaven. It's not something that appears to us in a dream and goes, oh, this is who I am. It's rather a social construct, yeah?
Absolutely. Irving Goffman, sociologist, has spoken very widely about this issue in terms of the ways that we construct our identity correspond directly to the environments, to the places that we're living and the people that surround us. And that some of the best ways we can learn about the identities we construct and claim as our own is really to do cultural investigations. So culturally interrogating what are the meanings and messages attached to these social constructs of identity, race, gender, class,
sexuality,
age. Absolutely.
Yeah. Nation, religion, all of these that people can put on like labels and wear around, and sometimes just have those labels slapped on them, whether they will or not. And it occurs to me that there are several patterns, several stages where identity gets acted out. We have identities that are intimate with our partner or our very closest friends, and no one else really may know that identity with us. We have identities of the self and say, our family, a slightly larger circle. And then this identity of self in society where there are all kinds of people with all sorts of agendas looking to identify us and determine what we are. What's going on there?
Well, that's a really fascinating question. I think, we talk about this a lot in our women's and gender studies classes, particularly around the intersections between understanding ourselves as individuals and how that corresponds with the understandings that are circulating in our own communities as well as in our own historical time period. That even over a short period of time, and we talk with students in this moment, 2015, to reflect back on the 1950s around some of the identities that were circulating. They seem very, very foreign in terms of their meaning and symbolism, so that they're changing constantly. Identities are corresponding both to, as you mentioned, the individual sort of intimate experiences that are really personal, as well as the more cultural and community kinds of identities that we may both claim and also have put upon us. That is, how do others interpret us? And then there are those institutional identities. How do they circulate with regards to structures of power and the recreation of hierarchies and social dynamics? Largely inequalities.
Largely inequalities, and identities are largely imposed on people by people who are higher in the power hierarchy. So it becomes a way of fragmenting groups. It becomes a way of organizing subgroups and then inscribing them with various kinds of agency or non-agency, various kinds of voice or non-voice. So Emma Sukovich becomes the rape victim. Whatever else she is, this is her identity. And whatever else, one is, you're walking down the street and somebody goes, "Hey, what are you?" I don't know what to say sometimes. What do you mean? What am I? Why do you need to pigeonhole me? Why do you need to give me an identity? And it dawned on me that a lot of people have this need to impose identity because it gives them a sense of stability and comprehension of who these other people around them in the world are. So they can put them into little boxes and put them into little pegs and say, okay, so you're a straight person, you're a gay person, you're a black person. And we'll get into some of the philosophical problems with doing this, but isn't identity finally a very fragile and changeable and protean kind of idea that morphs and alters?
Absolutely. I think identity as a social construct is very, very fluid, very, very malleable. Of course, that doesn't mean that it hasn't and doesn't continue to have implications for social structural relations, right? So you mentioned right from the get-go, in fact, we all know when infants are born within Western culture, we are labeled, our bodies are labeled, we are given a classification generally as either male or female, and that begins to be a foundation for the way the culture is actually creating differences. Infants are relatively similar to one another, and yet this immediate classification can shape all kinds of things about the environments that they experience, including the toys that children are exposed to, the ways that others interact with them, how they speak with them, how they are intimate or not intimate with them, their expectations and roles, and so on. So this, really is, we're talking about how is our human consciousness really evolving around notions of identity that have potentially served us, but also really contributed to the structure of inequalities that we are struggling with today.
And I think a lot of that is, there are, of course, several foundations to that inequality and that process of manifesting and projecting inequalities. But it strikes me that right from the beginning, we're working with binary oppositions. So people are defining themselves in terms of what they are not.
Yes.
And what they are not, if I'm straight, then you're something I'm not if you're gay. If I'm white, you're something I'm not if I'm black, right? So, and ultimately it seems that they're really trying to stabilize not so much the knowledge of others, but a much more functionalist sort of stability they're seeking. So who can I love? Who can I screw? Who can I marry? Who can I hate? Who can I kill? Who do I need to run from? Who threatens me in concrete ways? And it's really sorting out a series of functions socially for people.
Absolutely. I think the labels that get placed upon us oftentimes are a reflection of the dominant culture. That is, when I did my research back in my book publication of The Making of Modern Girlhood, where I was talking with pre-adolescent girls, one of the primary findings of that research was that girls, even young pre-adolescent girls in the early part of the 21st century, while they're negotiating the hybridity of identities, the way in which identity they might adopt aspects of masculinity into their sense of self, that they were constantly defining themselves not only in relation to the others. So girls specifically, the pre-adolescent girls that I was talking to, talked about, what I am not is I am not a boy. And then they went about defining what girlhood meant and their subjectivity meant in relation to not being a boy, right? And so that really speaks to this notion of also Aristotle historically classifying human bodies as male. The male body as the standard, or the white body as the standard. And so those classifications are already infused with cultural, not only meaning, but implications around social status.
Well, and Freud, woman is the male with the thing missing, with the phallus missing. And even in biology, women's sexual organs, the clitoris in particular, was referred to for decades as a vestigial penis.
Yes.
When actually it's more the other way around. The penis is a sort of mutated clitoris. But because it was written by men, this is how it had to work. So we have, and even in those cases where we do define around sex, the organs in particular, there's a great deal of variation, and a rather large number of people who are born with indeterminate sexual organs. The Jews, the ancient Jews in the Torah, there are actually 6 kinds of sex,
Yes.
Depending on a much broader differentiation. It's not this rigid binary that we're so locked into here, which also then locks us into thinking, into acting, into dressing, into sexualities that really don't reflect anything except a power structure that's been around forever.
Absolutely. And, you're referencing so much research that has been done. We talk about it a lot, specifically in my sex and gender classes, where how does our westernized perspective limit the ways we understand ourselves? That is, our bodies and the things you were mentioning earlier, ways of connecting, ways of loving, ways of being, even potentials within the world that Anne Fausto Sterling, who is a prominent feminist biologist, has identified, her earlier work identified up to 5 sexes and so forth, that the variations, in fact, refer to the ways that biology loves variation. It is human beings and our cultural structures that are attached to those dichotomous ways of seeing ourselves and others in the world in order to differentiate. And the function, you mentioned functionalism, really asking that question of our listeners and also ourselves, what function do these divisions serve? How do they serve us and how do they limit us? And that was certainly what I heard you mentioning, which is the ways that we are constrained by these very limited understandings of the categories that exist for identification.
Well, I would agree with you there. And I want to turn for a minute to this piece by Robin D.G. Kelley. This is back from the journal Color Lines back in 1999. And I don't want to read the whole article because it is rather lengthy, but it's very good and worth reading. And she addresses this question of, what are you? That she's been asked her whole life. What are you? And, she says her stock answers rarely changed. But as she gets into the matter, she gives a couple of examples. One is about her little brother, who came out looking just like his father, who was white, but had to integrate into the black communities in Los Angeles and Pasadena, where he had to fight his way into blackness. And then he got tired of that, and he became what people thought he was, a cool white kid. And today, now he's living in Tokyo, speaks fluent Japanese, and is happily married to a Japanese woman who's actually a Korean passing as Japanese. He stands as a perfect example of our mulattoness, a black boy trapped in a white body who speaks English with a slight Japanese accent and has a son who will spend his life confronting, quote, the question, what are you? And I love our next paragraph here because it goes right to the heart of the matter. Although folk had trouble naming us, we were never blanks or aliens in a black world. We were and are polycultural. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about all the peoples in the Western world. It is not skin, hair, walk, or talk that renders black people so diverse. Rather, it is the fact that most of them are products of different cultures, living cultures, not dead ones. These cultures live in and through us every day with almost no self-consciousness about hierarchy or meaning. Polycultural works better than multicultural, which implies that cultures are fixed, discrete entities that exist side by side, a kind of zoological approach to culture. Ooh, here's the camels, right? Such a view obscures power relations, but often reifies race and gender differences, because we have these very set notions of what culture is.
Yes. Well, this reminds me very much of the conversations and debates around identity politics as they emerged when I was an undergraduate in the early 1990s. And a lot of the literature at that time was trying to deal with diversity, issues of diversity, and then the emergence of this term. I mean, because really what we're talking about is how does terminology carry these different meanings, this terminology around multiculturalism, and all of a sudden multiculturalism was being integrated into every aspect of one's life, the curriculum, the work setting, etc. And yet the point that your author that you've just shared here from the piece Polycultural Me really problematizes the way that idea of diversity got co-opted and institutionalized, and then limited once again by this notion of multicultural. And it's not just the word that might be problematic, because people might say, okay, well then do we use polycultural and then that solves the problem? Part of the problem is really the interaction between institutions and the reproduction of those divisions as part of the power dynamics that people are invested in and that benefit from. And so who benefits from these divisions is part of what we may begin to look at. And how can we as individuals and as communities begin to challenge those divisions so that we can create the kind of communities and worlds that we want to live in, right? I tell my students constantly that while they are negotiating various identities that they may both claim and have attributed to them, they are also co-creators of culture. And that means that we are accountable for not only the language that we use, but the meanings that go along with that language, how we might change our really dichotomous approach to understanding ourselves as male, female, black, white, intersexed, or cisgendered, and so on. That the language in some ways both challenges, but can also reproduce those divisions. So how do we create different kinds of conversations?
And in the U.S., the culture is built around driving differences through this myth of assimilation, that you have to become American. You have to give up your language, you have to give up your culture, give up the way you dress, except, of course, for some festive holiday when the white folks come out of the hills to look at you and, say, oh, isn't that quaint? So we insist on a white culture. We insist on a white culture built around some strange ideas of European culture. We insist on a culture that is dominated by masculinity. We insist on a culture that's dominated by some very strange ideas of Christianity, and it's all held together with this belief that to be an American, you've got to be those things, and that you're not truly an American if you're polycultural. And this is so bloody absurd. Yes. I mean, the hillbilly music is Irish. The rock and roll is African. There are all of these polycultural valences playing out all the time, but there's this appropriation of them and claiming them as white culture. So black music became okay when white folks started doing it. And before then, it was jungle music, and decent white folks weren't going to listen to that. It'd be okay if you're a beatnik or something. But so the insistence upon a particular kind of identity strikes me as not a position of strength, but a position of weakness and fragility, where everything that is, however slightly different, becomes threatening.
Absolutely. I think, you're touching on issues of fear and specifically, these notions of borders and boundaries as they relate potentially to nationalism. When you're talking about Westernization, I recall studying abroad in Budapest in the 1990s, and we were very heavily involved in conversations about global Westernization and specifically the different generations of Hungarians at that time talking about fear of loss of culture with the increasing Westernization. But I think the other piece that you also brought to our attention is that it's not just about Westernization, but how Western practices have also and continue to be directly linked to a political economic structure. And so how does capitalism as an economic structure really benefit and is bound to these kinds of divisions, and also what you mentioned earlier, which is the lens of seeing ourselves as fragmented. It's much easier to sell products and to sell
wars.
Absolutely. If we are told you can only be on one side, you can't have complex kinds of positions around issues of being at or going to war. And certainly with the 2011, at that time I was living on the East Coast in Massachusetts, but not far from New York, and a lot of the conversations were around what kind of person you were based on if you identified as a patriot. And patriotism was directly linked to, do you subscribe to everything that the government is, saying is necessary in order for security and safety? And again, really driving a culture of fear of others and fear of one's safety. And when we're functioning at that level, that's a really base level to be operating.
And groups do that, though. I mean, it's a given in small groups, or large groups even, that when the group is threatened, it tends to contract, it tends to tighten its boundaries, be much more precise about who's in the group and who's out of the group, much more conformist, much more conservative. And you see this time and again, and of course politicians and PR types and advertisers are adroit at playing this card. So ISIS, ooh, terror, ooh, it's a nonsense, but it's a card that plays well in national identification, national identity, in racial identity, and religious identity. Jews and Christians, okay, Buddhists, Muslims, no. Where you can write off a whole people on the basis of, say, a religious identity, or
without any real understanding of the religion and or the cultural practices that accompany that religious belief system, right? So I really constantly am going back to that question that I ask myself and I ask of my students, which is, what is it that I'm afraid of? And if I can really stop and step back and identify, number one, to be reflective about being afraid, right, which can also be a courageous thing to do, and or a necessity, as marginalized groups talk about it, that once you identify what the fear is, then we can move into a different way of being, right? I don't have to operate from the place of fear if I know what is motivating my fear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we look at, I agree with you completely on that. There's an opportunity to understand oneself in the context of confronting the other. Yes. And, oh, you're different from me, and this causes me some funny feelings. And we're not very good in this culture at training people, especially training men, to identify otherness and use as an opportunity for self-exploration, as well as for maybe meeting someone new. You know, actually sitting down and talking with someone who professes the Muslim faith.
Yes.
But, you know, we have these linguistic, social, interpersonal, and legal definitions all woven together around these rather strange cultural constructions where one is expected to become or to be this. In one's entire existence is supposed to reflect this identity. So if you're black, you're supposed to be whatever that is. And if you're a lesbian, you're supposed to be whatever that is. I don't know, wearing flannel and driving a Subaru. Or whatever. You're supposed to fit the stereotype, and people get really freaked out when one doesn't.
Yes.
Right? So, but these become the defining characteristics of one's whole existence, both in terms of meaning, but also in terms of ontology, in terms of the actual living of one's experience. Because black people and women and Muslims and any marginalized group have an experience that's very different from the experience of white males, very different from the experience of people in positions of privilege. Mm-hmm. And it's not something they choose and go, oh, well, I'm going to choose to be treated badly, to be threatened by cops, to have people think I'm a criminal, to have people think I'm a pervert, whatever. It's not that people choose this, but it becomes then the whole of their existence through the ways in which the legal system identifies them, from the ways in which the language of the culture describes them, from the kinds of social activities they're allowed into and out of, and these change so quickly. I mean, look what happened to the Jewish people, who, in my lifetime, Jewish people, and it still happens, I know, but it was common for Jewish people to be excluded from clubs, from some kinds of hotels, from restaurants, simply on the basis of this identification of Jew. And they never even bothered to specify, is it about the religion or is it about the blood?
Right, right. Because it didn't matter to a large extent. It was really about, as you were saying when we started, what is the function of these differentiations, and how do those differences serve an existing cultural power structure? And this is another thing. I get really excited. I just love teaching, and so I will share one more thing that I share with my students, which is, you know, our culture has generally, and when I say our, I mean Western culture, over the last 20, 30 years, at least in the time that I've been growing up, has largely put forth these lenses of difference. And Michael Kimmel, who's also a feminist scholar, talks about critiquing these lenses of difference. Why is it that we don't focus more on sameness? And what would happen if we both recognized, yes, there are ways that we are different, but what if we focused on all the ways that we are similar? We are so much more similar in so many ways than we are different, and yet it is the differences where we seem as a cultural means for maintaining those constraints and boundaries around our relationships and our sense of self and even our potential to be attached to this notion of difference. And what happens if we change that lens? What if there's really a paradigmatic shift to having people think about all the ways we are similar and then also recognizing ways in which we are different? And that's not at all to minimize those differences in the ways that people experience them in very concrete material ways in their lives, but just to say at a cultural level, at a symbolic level, at a way of connecting with one another, that there are so many ways that children and our experiences might be different if we were focusing on sameness.
Commonalities, yeah.
Commonalities,
that makes
yes.
a great deal of sense. As James Carey once wrote, the smallest differences create the greatest ambiguities. It's on those little things that we go, whoa, wait. I don't get this because it's very different from my experience.
Yes.
But exploring those points, we might realize there are many more commonalities than we think. I was thinking of well, let's take an identity that's rooted in an activity or action that maybe one performed or was performed on one. And the first thing I thought was rape victims, because I opened with Emma Sulkovitz. And so you get male rape victims and female rape victims. This is not the same identity. It is not a uniform identity of rape victim or survivor of rape.
Yes.
It's gendered. See, it's gendered in ways that are completely different, although they have remarkable similarities. They're actually identical in some ways, except for this gendering quality.
Yes.
So if you think of how it's very difficult, for instance, for women to self-identify as a sexual violence survivor.
Yes.
Yet it's much more difficult for men because of the other parts of the identity that hold that masculine picture together. Just like a different set of parts hold the feminine, the idea of the feminine together for women.
Yes.
Victims. So identity is not this or that. It's this and that and that and that and that and this other thing over here,
yes.
and some experience, and what you decide to make out of it all is a big part. So.
Yes, layers upon layers upon layers. And, on this issue of sexual assault and violence, why we have a significant underreporting of sexual assault and violence has a lot to do with our culture's focus on blaming and shaming individuals rather than dealing with issues. And how I feel like this is directly connected to our conversation is that we've really begun to make some progress in moving forward around issues of rape and sexual assault now that we realize this is a human issue, right? This is an issue that we all are invested in, and you don't have to be a survivor of sexual violence to be invested in this issue, right? You don't have to be male, you don't have to be female. It doesn't matter what you are. It's about recognizing that this issue is something that affects all of us, and it's worth being involved in because it is intimately touching all of our lives, either as individuals or through the individuals that we love. And many, many times in classrooms, just this last quarter, I had students who would share that it was through thinking about how they might experience this particular thing, even if they hadn't, that they became passionate about it. And I think that speaks to alliance building around social justice issues, that when we see them as human issues rather than as black issues or women's issues or issues around sexuality, then we're really talking about definitions of citizenship, right? We're really talking about the rights that people have and or should have under the protections of one's governance. Yeah.
Yeah. So people can also use identities, I think I hear you saying, as a way of coming together and maybe there's not a rigidly shared identity, but it can be a way of building groups in and around these complex, constantly changing identities for strength, for social change, for help, for power, political power, for organizing. So there are a lot of ways that identities can come together, and we are so limited in the way that we think of groups as being organized around some sort of rigid telos,
yes.
some sort of rigid end. We are here to do this, and this is who we are. Instead of saying, oh, here's a big, diverse group of people with a range of ideas and opinions. We're seeing more and more of this, like with the Occupy movement, for example. A diverse range of identities with enough overlap, with enough recognition of the other as still like oneself.
Yes.
As you were saying, that commonality of humanity, of
yes.
experience, of joy and pain, and all of the things that make us human, and all of those cultural influences that come together in our world.
Yes. And this is not, what I'm about to say is not to put forth a sort of post-structuralist perspective.
Oh, thank God.
But to say that I think there's a lot more success, at least I've had a lot more success when I address these social concerns through a lens of issues rather than identities, because you don't have to hold an identity to speak on behalf of what an issue is putting forth. That is, I don't have to be intersexed, although I may be. That's not relevant. But if I don't have to be intersexed in order to be an ally to intersexed individuals, right? And to that community. And I think the issue, again, I get really passionate about going back to, it's like, why are we here? We're here because politics fuels some of the, much of the discussions, debates, laws, policy making that occurs, and therefore when we participate in politics, if we come with a passion for addressing issues rather than identities, I think we'll have a lot more success as a community and as a culture.
I think that's a very good point, and there's a moral obligation too for people who have some privilege above others, and it may not even be a lot more privilege, but some moral obligation to use that privilege to help give voice to the voiceless, to help give protection to those in need, to make other people aware of injustice or aware of wrongdoings that need addressing. And getting away from this, oh, well, this is a thief, or this is a criminal, or this is a fag, or this is a dyke, and those kinds of boxes that scared people use to bulwark
Yes.
their belief in this very fragile sense of self against a world that they don't understand and have no tools to understand it with. And the simple thing would be for them to just drop their shields and sit down and talk openly, not with the idea of, now I'm going to react against you. I'm going to tell you why you're bad and you're going to hell, or I'm going to tell you why I hate you because you call God by a different name, or I'm going to tell you why you're not as smart as me because you have different genitalia. It would be so simple.
Yeah.
Just to drop the shields and meet the other.
Absolutely.
And it's so threatening to people.
Right. And in some ways, I don't know how simple it would be, but in the sense that it is a worthy journey. And I guess I'm thinking back to the discussion about, when we talk about privilege, it's Michel Foucault who says privilege is most powerful when it operates as invisible to us, right? Mm-hmm. And so some of the beginning points, when we start to see lenses where groups of people are being fragmented, are also to stop and to understand, well, how do I fit into this fragmented formulated discourse, and if I am operating with privilege, because first, privilege very often isn't recognized, and because it isn't something that people work for, but they just are given. It takes a lot of work within our culture to begin to see privilege in our own lives in a daily way. And once we see privilege, then absolutely that is the place, the space, the moment when we can become invigorated with conversation and cultural curiosities about how this privilege is operating, and if it's not operating in a way that is conducive to our desired definitions of citizenship or humanity, that we then begin to use our privilege to create something different. That means that we both recognize and are accountable for our privilege while simultaneously taking actions to join in struggles around the inequalities that our privilege have basically been derived from. Yeah.
That's well said. I was, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking where I'd like to go next with our conversation. We insist that individuals must have an identity, and as I was working on this show earlier today, I was thinking, how can identity be individual? But we insist on this. It's a real problem, and I'll get into it in a minute. But we insist, as a culture, as a people, that the individual must represent the group, and the group, of course, represents the individual. Mm-hmm. So if you are black, you are all of those people, and all of those people are you, or any one of them are you. If you're white, you're all of these people. If you are gay, you're all. So we have this idea that somehow the individual must represent the group, and the group must represent the individual. But individual literally comes from the Latin meaning indivisible. You can't be split off. You are that which can't be divided into more of the same, right? So by its very definition, it excludes the idea that you are representational of the group, or that the group is representational of you. And it's only, you were talking a minute ago about politics and capital, and it's only with the rise of liberal capitalism in the 18th and 19th and centuries, especially this idea of the individual having identity and having a self and out there working for one's, and really having no connection to all of these other people. It's all about you. It's all about getting what you want, which is a really twisted idea.
Absolutely.
Of the individual. I mean, that was Marx's critique of it. It's abstract, made-up nonsense. That laws and society are derived from our individual selves. No.
Not at all. I mean, neoliberal politics wants to, in fact, encourage us to see ourselves as individuals, right? And again, the question is, who does that benefit? How does that actually not benefit the society when we adopt these lenses where we are so divided from one another that we don't see how it, in fact, requires our interactions with others in order to even gain that sense of individuality. And so your point is well taken, that I really think there's both an economic and a political attachment to reproducing and reselling these notions of individuality, because they allow us to strive for something that can never be achieved. And this is not that dissimilar from the ways that, in terms of embodiment and embodiment of gender has often been linked in terms of the female identified body as a fragmented spectacle that women are learning, girls are learning, and continue to learn about themselves as fragmented, that we think about and boys and men as well.
Yeah.
We think there are parts of myself. My elbow is beautiful, but my kneecap, is just a little bit droopy, or these ridiculous things that really take away from the time and energy that we might spend and invest on conversations about the world rather than on flaws or problems that need to be fixed through some purchasing power.
Well, I mean, Caitlyn Jenner just sucked all the air right out of the media sphere by coming out as transex.
Yes.
And suddenly it's all, give back your gold medals because blah 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 blah. And even with the reality of who this person is now, so many people can't break out of their mind forged manacles, to use Blake's term, that lock them down so that they only see the world in one way. And so when a person who has struggled
yes.
her entire life and was very successful in one gender
Mm-hmm.
makes the flip to another sex, this is somehow up there with I don't know, the three-headed man in the circus or some sort of chimera that because it challenges those rigid definitions that most people think they need.
Yes,
to survive.
demarcating masculinity from femininity and the expectations that are attached to that in terms of who that person should be and how they should express themselves in relation to the body that they've been born into. And, that of all things really takes away from, if we want to say it, the individual, or what might be more rightly or correctly put as authenticity. How do we live authentically? And how do we not be constrained by these boundaries and borders that are not circulating with individuals or communities in mind, but rather with the production of particular power structures and their maintenance. So I think it's fascinating both how much coverage people will get in this case when we have hundreds of thousands, just numerous individuals who are challenging the ways that they've struggled with the way they've been labeled, whether it's racial or national, religious, ethnic, gender, sexuality, that we've been struggling with this, and yet there are individuals who become a cultural spectacle to us, and that we play out both this blaming and shaming and ways of reinscribing if this person is legitimate. It's not really about Caitlyn Jenner. Mm-hmm. It's about the culture really having strong resistance to the fluidity of, if we even want to call it identity, to the fluidity of that. And certainly to live with authenticity requires space for being malleable, that things change over our lifetime. And I talk to my students again about this in Sex and Gender, that when sexuality and sexual desires and preferences and hormones and so forth, they will fluctuate throughout your lifetime. They're different when you're 5, they're different when you're 15, they're different when you're 30, and so on. Why must we see things as stable, and how does that really...
When they're really not.
They're really not.
And it makes us brittle and frozen and petrified and so easily broken.
Yes.
And
just divided.
And divided, that rigidity.
Yes.
We take these ideas. I think one of the problems here is that so many people think that things like race and gender and culture and the specifics of those, or religion, are somehow timeless concepts, unchanging. They handed down by God in the Garden of Eden or some nonsense like that. And in fact, what we see is these things changing constantly. The very word race,
yes,
the very word race didn't appear in the English language until the 16th century or so, where it meant something like an offspring or a line of descent, right? It also meant a kind of a species, right? Well, the race of horses, right? It also meant a sort of general class, the human race. But the problem started showing up when we used it to define a group inside of a group as a race. When we started talking about the races of men. And this really shows up in the late 18th, early 19th century. And this, of course, leads us to craziness like Blumenbach's work, where he's going to differentiate the races of humans based on skulls and skin color and jawbones and all kinds of nonsense, which opens the door to prejudice and politics, the politics of an empire that wants to classify all of these other people as not really people.
Yes. I mean, the oldest idea, right? Divide and conquer is achieved by these things. And again, it's not difference that is the actual problem, but the meaning that gets ascribed to those differences. The current research coming out of neuroscience around male brains and female brains. Might there be difference in the ways that these brains look and are functioning? Yes. But any meaning we ascribe to the differences is completely culturally infused. And there's just this great book, in case anyone wants to check it out, by Cordelia Fine called Delusions of Gender, that really challenges a lot of that research on, why do we ascribe these differences in meaning, and that it's not just about difference, but about, in fact, oftentimes replicating inequalities and then justifying, legitimating the ways in which we treat others as less than fully human. Totally a human-produced idea, and not in the interest of all of us.
Well, and again, it's setting up standards that don't really exist.
Exactly.
It's like this idea of the pure stock of the human races. So that you got the Aryans, or you got the babies who should just be killed, and we can create there are a bunch of strange and dangerous ideas that have snuck into a lot of these definitions that have no place there or anywhere.
Yes. How mythical norms then become the basis for defining deviance and pathology. So what is normal? Normal is defined in opposition to what is categorized as deviant. How does the DSM-4, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, used by psychological
psychiatrists and psychologists
and therapists, that
shrinks.
It's used really to classify, dis-ease, but that's in connection to what we've thought about and constructed as the norm. And again, this is coming up hugely within the ableism community, right? Which is, the world is not constructed without thought of movement. It's simply that people who move differently through the world are not being thought about as we continue to construct architectural buildings. And so all these various ways that we can continue to challenge what we think of as the norm, what gets talked about as this mythical norm. Mythical norms are based on privilege and the invisibility of that privilege, right? And so becoming more clear about how those are operating, even when we hold that privilege, right, as an able-bodied person. Can I be aware of the ways that this structure is not inviting to others? And if I was an engineer or, a designer, that I might do it differently, that we can do it differently.
That would be a good thing, because it seems to me that you're embarking on a project that Merleau-Ponty once described in his Phenomenology of Everyday Life, where he said that when someone beholds you, when someone looks at you, when their gaze strikes you, it steals away a part of your being. And the only way you can reclaim that being is by using language. When they steal it away, they put it in one of their terms. You're a woman, you're a Muslim, you're black, you're gay, you're liberal, you're redneck, whatever. But that gaze steals that away. And with words, with speaking, and with many people speaking, I think we recapture our being. And in so doing, we change the frame. The social frame in which all these sequelae that we've been talking about that fall out from identification can be broken and transformed and sometimes strengthened.
Yes. Yes. One quick thing, Merleau-Ponty also shared this great example of hands, that if we take our two hands and we place them up against one another, we can't really determine which hand is touching the other, that in fact that it's connected, right? And this is again related back nicely to our conversation about the individual as an extension of the community, as an extension of the culture, and that they're constantly overlapping. These are one and the same. And how can we move forward in order to go hand in, well, maybe not hand in hand, but in recognition of our connection. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, I think it's a wonderful note to close out the show on. Thank you so much for coming. It's Jessica Willis. It's been a real pleasure. And what do I have to do here? I have to tell our readers, geez, listen to me. I have to tell the listeners that we're very appreciative for you tuning in. You can email me at longwaves, 2 words, at kyrs.org. You can find podcasts very shortly of this broadcast and of all the previous ones on YouTube. Look for Long Waves Radio, in quotes. And you can find me on Facebook, again, Long Waves Radio. So I love hearing from people. I thank you so much for listening. And I've got to tell you one more time before I'm off the air, you're still listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Till next week, have a great one.